Hello and welcome back. I know it's been quite a while since my last Algomancy video, but that's because I've been hard at work working on the Algomancy expansion. So for those who are a bit out of the loop, Algomancy is getting two new elements, Light and Dark, in an upcoming expansion. You can read more about it in the description. It's coming to Kickstarter sometime spring next year. And in this video, I want to break down just kind of what went into the development, specifically of the Dark element, because that was the hardest to design and kind of the element that started the idea of an expansion off in the beginning. And this journey has been 3 years. It's now the end of 2025, so almost a 4-year design process for the Dark element, which is honestly, I didn't realize it had been that long until I started making this presentation. And it makes sense in hindsight because designing the Dark element operated on a different axis than the base 5 elements of Algomancy, and getting that to mesh with the rest of the game is a really involved process. So this video is just going to go into why that happened, how that happened. You get to see some of the new cards. Pale Wing is one that I just love the art. Very excited about the art, the card, the effect, everything here is so cool. And it's really cool too because I have some of the old designs. These are, playtest art or whatever from 2022 that almost translated directly into the final designs. Couple things worth mentioning. There's still like many months of design left in the process. The art, the visuals, the names, the like unit types, and all of that stuff is very subject to change. So even Pale Wing, it's one of my favorite arts, but if it doesn't end up fitting the final design, might not end up in the final game. So a lot of the visuals you'll see for the Dark element like these are more like art direction than they are final art. Same with the names, like Nothir. It might end up in the final game, it might not. The effects are very, I think, tuned at this point. So just keep that in mind. The effects and stuff like that are great. The art is more just to give you a feel of what we're going for. Some might end up in the game, but not everything is like guaranteed to end up looking exactly like this. If you like something, let me know. I could make it more likely or less likely to end up if you like or dislike it. But anyway, yeah, let's talk about the Dark element. So in 2022, I was working on the Water element for the first Algomancy expansion. So you can see the old card template over here. Yeah, we used to have all the text on the bottom because we did all of our playtesting on Tabletop Simulator. And I thought it looked great. And then the moment that I held these cards in my hand and I couldn't see anything on the top, I was like, we got to put something on the top. There's a reason why most cards have cost in the top left and stuff like that. So we switched to the new frame. I think it looks much better. But the cards and the designs for the old Dark element will be in this old frame because that's just what we were working with at the time. So 2022, the Water element was doing a lot of cool things. There's Recall, which ended up in the final game slightly modified, as you can see here. We added a loss of life just to prevent you from... Basically, I wanted to add inevitability into the mechanic of recalling because this is like inherently stalls out games because you're taking mana that both players have spent and kind of undoing it. And so I wanted to add some loss of life onto that just to progress the game towards an end. And so the Water element looked a little bit different. It had Recall. It had Tidal Waves. Tidal Wave was a spell token that could recall a unit with cost less than or equal to the X value. So this card was crazy because it was a spell. You would play it, you would make a Tidal Wave, bounce something else. It was kind of fun. So you had Recall, you had units that made Tidal Waves, and then the idea was like you're putting cards in hand. What better way to take advantage of that than by discarding them for some effect? So like Ethereal Rector came about. Whenever it deals combat damage, you discard a card. It's got really big stats, but then a drawback. And then the idea was like you're putting cards into your hand, you're discarding cards, and then there was like a hand size matters theme with Growlithe, which is like when in combat, this creature's base might and mass. I know these cards are really old. Might and mass were the old templating for power and defense, but nobody understood what they meant, so we switched them out. But there were quite a few cards that cared about like number of cards in hand, and there were some triggers that were like when your hand size changes, which could trigger off a recall or a discard and things like that. So there was some cool stuff going on in the Water element. And then we started leaning more and more into the discard. Again, this is like really, really old playtest art for the cards, but an interesting theme nonetheless. But we had like Dark Lurker you could play from your discard by discarding cards, and then cards like Spawn of Madness, when you discard it, you can play one to put it into play. So we had all this like payoffs and stuff to support discard and recall. And turns out I really liked designing the discard payoff cards. So we ended up with, this is just a sampling of what the water element was turning into, because players really liked these mechanics. So you can kind of pause and read through some of them. I'll highlight a couple of my favorites. One of my favorites was the Bulark. This card was crazy. When it enters combat, which is the old templating for like attacks or blocks, you can graft and augment any number of cards from your discard onto it without paying their cost, then trigger all abilities grafted this way. So like you would just put a bunch of stuff in your bin and then attack with it one time and just nuke the board. It was so fun. 10 mana was a lot. Yeah, that was fun. Ended up being a rules nightmare, but it was really fun. Abduct, put target creature into your hand, then discard a card. Notably in Algomancy, there's no card ownership, so you could target opponent's creatures, put them into your hand, discard them, discard something else. This card was really fun. Bring back, switching creatures in play with creatures in discard was fun. And then Rouse ended up being probably the most broken card in the game. Graft or augment target card into discard onto target creature. The combo really ended up being you would have Bulark in your bin, and then you would rouse Bulark onto something else, triggering it. Something that costs 10 mana for the lowly price of 2 to graft it. So there's a lot of other cool stuff going on in this theme with like discard, play from the bin, all that fun stuff. But what ended up happening is, if you look at just this sampling of cards, it's 24 cards, and there's only 54 cards in an element. So just under half of the entire element was all a discard theme, and then the other half was what ended up making it into the water element. You had like, Rider of the Tides used to be whenever a player's hand size changes, that would trigger more off discard. But now it's just whenever a card enters a player's hand, it gets bigger. You have spell units, you have combat damage tricks, you have ambush, you have recall stuff, spells matter, big spells, recalling spells. So there was all this other cool stuff going on in the water element. And then there was this whole section over here of like just discard matters payoff themes. And in playtesting, it like became apparent that the players were really, really interested in this discard matters theme. And this didn't get the time to shine, but there's a lot of cool stuff happening here. And I tested 2 different options. I tested one, just making the water element all in discard, but I didn't have enough design experience to make things make sense or work. I'll talk about that a bit later, because I run into these problems again when I start designing the dark element. So it was the decision, I believe Eli the Duck, actually, from my Discord, was the one who's like, Caleb, you gotta cut these cards. And thank goodness he did, because yeah, we just completely scrapped all of these cards and rebuilt the water element from scratch. Now the water element is one of my favorites. It stands alone. It has a lot of cool themes going on. And for the added benefit, we get to have an element where we're not torn between all these different themes. We can have one element that's focused just on this really cool mechanic of doing stuff from your bin, discard matters, and all that stuff. And also, we were kind of fighting with the color palette for this as well, because you can see it's very dark. I had some rainbows in there and stuff, but it doesn't fit as well in water, which is blue color, as it does in dark, which you'll see later. So that's kind of what happened with the water element, and then we had to rebuild it from scratch. Or not from scratch, but we basically took, the remaining 20 cards, filled out a 54 card roster of all those cards, and it plays great. And then 2024, we've released the Algomancy expansion, or at least the Kickstarter has finished. So I can start working on the light and dark expansion. Specifically, dark is what I started with, and I kind of knew light was coming. But this video is just talking about dark. So we can re-theme the cards, put it in the new frame, get them in the dark element, so we get like black as the main color, and it's really exciting. So we start playtesting a lot, and that's why you can see the change on Pale Wing from when it does combat damage to an opponent to when I attack or block. Turns out, um, like, the problem with Catherian Rector before is when you're playing this card, you're either wanting to play it as a discard outlet or you're not. And the problem is when it deals combat damage to an opponent, discard a card is too late for most of the good discard, like, triggers to happen. You've already gone through combat. So if you get a removal spell, you can't clear blockers. If they block, you don't get your discard trigger. So what I thought when I first designed this, making discard harder to achieve would make the card better. It's actually worse because when you're playing a card that forces you to discard, you're usually doing that because you want to discard a card. And so making a card discard more often somehow made it more playable, which is really interesting. But it's basically like, if you're going to put a synergy on a card, you don't want to just half commit to it. You want full synergy. This, when I attack or block, you discard a card. If you don't care about discarding cards, it's not very good. But it's still a 1 mana 3/4 flyer with a Graft Enabler, so you can do other things. I did get to 1-for-1 take my favorite card from the original Water, which is put a creature in your hand, then discard a card. It's now a hybrid card because Dark doesn't really care about recall, but we get hybrid Dark Water, which is kind of thematic because Dark used to be in the Water element, but now it's put a unit into your hand, then discard a card. We just get that. And then this one was also so cool. Bring back, swap target creature in play with a creature in its owner's discard. We learned from a couple things with the Bulark and just design in general that I just never want to have mana cheating in Algomancy. For anyone who's played other card games, I come from a Magic the Gathering background. Like, Reanimator is my least favorite archetype because, I don't know, cheating on mana just bypasses so much of the game. So we bounded this in a pretty cool way where Necromorph exchanges units in play for units with cost less than or equal to it in the bin. So you're never going up on mana with a Necromorph, but that makes it still really cool as a removal spell on your opponent. Say they have they have a giant unit in play and a 1/1 in their bin. You can swap them. If you have a unit that's about to die, you can kind of downgrade it for something in your bin cheaper. So there's still a lot of play with this without having to resort to, oh, I turned my 1/1 token into a 10/10 creature. So I think this change made it way better because it's more playable and we don't have to worry about like people breaking the game that way. So there's a lot of changes I made to the element like this that just better quality of life. We've had 3 years of playtesting to go through. So these were more of the cards that basically were ported directly from the old Water element, like Catherian Rector, which eventually ended up turning into Pale Wing, came from the old Water element, Zyklop. All of these were directly there. And so the problem I had, we playtested with this for like a full year, just kind of as is, making a whole element out of this. And the problem really comes out is something that I like to call made-up synergies. This applies to a lot of different card games, like just anything in general. If you're designing cards or looking at the design of cards, if you can replace like one word in your card design with some random made-up word, and it doesn't change the way the card works, you might have a bit of a problem. So in this case, Catherian Rector says basically discard a card is what matters. And then this card, again, playtest name, Zyklop, I guess is how you say it, but that will change. When you discard me, you can pay 1 to put me in your bin. The only way to discard cards in Algomancy is by a trigger that says discard a card. So if you can replace this, like this thing just says floof, like a made up word, and this says when you floof, hooray, you get your synergy. This becomes a problem because now you have this like really parasitic coupling of cards where this card is only working with specific enablers that say floof, or in this case, discard a card. So if you look at Zyklop, compared to every other card in Algomancy, like the base game is really cool because every card interacts with so many other cards on so many different levels, and it's like discovering those synergies that's fun, because Immolate, you can sacrifice units to draw a card. It's a spell, so it triggers spell synergies, triggers dying synergies. It lets you protect your stuff from removal. It's graftable, so you can put it onto something, do something else. Zyklop, it only triggers off discard. It doesn't do it when it dies. It doesn't do it when you draw it. You can't really get much benefit out of playing this as a unit. It's just really one-dimensional. Compare that to something like Reality Bender as well. It's a pretty weird effect. It's inverted, so it reverses the stat changes. So if something gets plus X, it's minus X, and the same, or the opposite. So minus X becomes plus. From the base game, like you can compare this with Tenebrous Bulborb. You can turn an opponent's removal spell into a pump spell. You can play it yourself to turn removal spells into pump spells. If something has -1/-1 counters, you can play it to grow your team. If an enemy has a thing with a lot of plus counters, you can play it to kill it. If they play like a Burgeon to double their power, you can play this to make them have no power. Like, there's a lot of cool different avenues that cards in Algomancy work on, and this just doesn't do that. And so the problem really is this archetype of discard and interacting with the bin is just so isolated from like the rest of Algomancy designs that even if we do add more support to it, like you add more cards that help this, you're going to get this like self-contained synergy that doesn't mesh with the rest of the game. Any who have like played other card games and experienced this, I think my experience comes from Magic the Gathering, like madness themes. If you've ever drafted a set that has madness in it or done a cube, like this is kind of what happens. It's like either you're playing the discard theme or you're not, and it's really binary. There's no in-betweens. And that was a major problem. This took about 2 years of playtesting design. Our goal is to have it mesh harmoniously with the game. And it got all the way until 2025 this year, where we found a solution. And that is trash. Just instead of using discard as the synergy, which is, again, discard is kind of a made-up word in the sense that only one thing triggers it. If you look at more mechanic-driven things, like what is actually happening, this is what got us there. Trash is when a card hits a bin. So now that triggers off discard, triggers if it dies, triggers if it's been milled, and there's like so many different interesting mechanical ways to make any of those things happen. So if we look at Cyclop from the 2024 version, and then we update it into the modern version, when I am trashed. So this means basically when I die, when you discard me, when you mill me, you can do a thing. So you still get your discard synergies, but we'll talk about later, this has so many more implications that solves basically the rest of the problems. So Afflicting Anima, we'll talk about what Wraith is in a little bit. It's just a creature token. So basically, it's a 3/3. So it's kind of very similar to this. When you discard me, you can pay 1 to get a 3/3. When I am trashed, you can pay 1 to make a 3/3. And so this card's awesome because now you can get benefit from so many different avenues of the game. You can play it as it's intended and then just block with it. It'll be trashed. You can pay. You can attack with it. If it dies, you can pay 1 to trash. So you can get payoffs just by playing the base axis of the game, which is playing a unit. You can discard it to Pale Wing, and now you have this really cool synergy where Pale Wing's this 3/4 flying, like massive stats for its cost with a drawback, but then you turn its drawback into a benefit because now you're playing this as like a battle speed spell to make a 3/3 creature, which is really cool. But you can also pair it with sacrifice themes like Immolate, so you can play this out, sacrificing it will trash it, so you can make a Wraith. It's like such a small tweak to the wording on cards, but it made all the difference. Instead of, if this says when I'm discarded, this doesn't really work, you can't play it. It only works if you have Pale Wing. And so I'm just so happy about this change. It makes so many things so much better. And let's talk about more. Catherian Color. This was directly a playtest card in the old water element that we got to bring directly into Dark. Used to say each player in this region discards a card, and then whenever a player discards a card, this deals 1 damage. Now it says whenever a card is trashed, each opponent loses 1 life, and then after combat, each player discards a card. So the enabler is still the same, because each player discards a card as an enabling effect is mechanically interesting. You're putting them down resources, things like that. But as a trigger, like a synergy thing to build around, it's not interesting because if there's only 8 cards that make someone discard, there's not a lot you can do with it. But when a card is trashed, it's very common. So you can play this in a discard deck, but you can also pair this with things that want units to die, right? Whenever a unit dies, I'll deal 1 damage to each opponent. That's really cool. There is an important distinction about cards being trashed that also gives Dark its own flair, which is trashed only works for non-token cards. Like actual physical cards that enter the bin is what trigger trashed. So this also gives us interesting separation between what the fire element is doing, which is typically you want to make a lot of tokens and then sacrifice those tokens to trigger it. The tokens aren't going to become trashed because they don't actually physically like stay in your bin. So they're not going to trigger the color. So it gives you this differentiation between the color and, you know, fire-based sacrifice stuff, but then also the synergy because they both care about things dying. Non-token units dying trigger both of them. It's just really cool. And this is something we're still looking at, changing some of the enablers. Also, if you don't like this art, sorry, it is likely placeholder, but I did want something gross because this is something that does like devour the depths, right? You discard cards or sacrifice creatures to grow, so it's kind of eating at the bottom. So the idea is there, but I don't know. Let me know what you think about the art because this could easily change. But Shady Shores came up with the idea of maybe reworking the enabler. So instead of just being able to discard a card, making them mirror what the trashed synergy is, which is discard a card or sacrifice a non-token unit to gain +2/+2. Either way, you're trading one real card for some kind of benefit. This just makes it a little bit more flexible and interact in many different ways. Now, discard tends to be the most cost-effective way to trigger trashed synergies, but there are other ways too. So Blightwalker, for example, when I am trashed, you can pay 2 to recall another target unit from your bin. It's cool because you can play this as a unit and sacrifice it to Pallid Gorger. Like, it doesn't really matter which order you draw them in, you can still assemble the synergy. And that's kind of what Algomancy is about, is because the game is so dynamic, we want you to be able to assemble synergies on the fly. So, like, it's great if you can turn 1 Pallid Gorger, turn 2 discard, you know, draw a Blightwalker, discard it. That's fine. But we want to set it up to where if you turn 2 a Blightwalker and you draw a Pallid Gorger later, you can still get your synergy payoff. Slightly more expensive because you had to pay mana for this and stuff, but you can still get there. So this is something we're testing. Can't guarantee it will end up in the final game, but just having a couple of the key payoffs let you discard or sacrifice might make it a little bit more flexible. We'll see. And something like Cinder Scuttler, again, is really cool because this is a creature you can play, and then when it does combat damage, you recall it. So you can either discard it pre-combat, hit your opponent, or if you've already played it, sacrifice it to grow. It's just like way more, like so many more levels of synergy with this wording. So that's something we're trying. That wasn't enough to fix the problems with the dark element because discard is just such a hard mechanic to make work because cards in hand are so valuable in Algomancy. So you'll see there's many more things we've done to help meld the payoffs work with the cards. So we used to had cards like Sacrifice, which is 3 mana spell. Each opponent sacrifices a non-token unit, and then little extra synergy. When I'm discarded, you can pay 1 to play me. So this is kind of nice. You can like play it as a spell, or you can discard it and get the spell effect. Again, the problem is this line of discarded synergy, if there's only like, there's 54 cards in the set, maybe there's 10 enablers. If there's only 10 enablers and you just don't see a card that says discard, like this line doesn't matter. So the first thing we did is tried to replace many of the spells in the dark element with units that have the spell effect. So Sacrifice Dude, now, again, placeholder name, when I enter your bin, which was the wording before trashed, you can pay 3 if you do each opponent sacrifice a non-token unit. So now you can discard it, get a trigger, make them sacrifice, or you can play it as a creature and then kill it, make them sacrifice. The last line we're looking at, because if you make this swap, you lose the instant speed interaction you get by, like, if you could just take the card sacrifice. So we went one step further and gave basically cards that we originally wanted to be spells the ability to just discard themselves as an alternate cost. And this is like the template we have for alternate cost. Still working on the visuals, but now you can play it as a unit, or for 2 mana you can discard it, at any time. I think I need to put the battle symbol there. But anyway, we're working on the visuals, but you can spend 2 mana to discard it and then trigger the effect. So now we took what was a very one-dimensional spell you just play. And now we have this really interesting card where you can play it as a unit. You can play it as 2 mana plus 2 mana, which is 4 mana to make each opponent sacrifice a non-token unit. Fairly expensive, but at least you have the option. If you need to trigger something else that's like, when I discard a card, do a thing, you could just spend 2 mana to discard this, have no other effect. And then if you have a discard payoff, this is much cheaper. It's just 2 mana to make them sacrifice. So we did this with quite a few spells, just turned them into creatures with other effects. And it's a lot more, it's opened up the play a lot more for the element. And the other cool benefit is it gives us a different avenue to attack counter magic and stuff like that, because most things that interact with opponents like this are spells. And so we've balanced counter spells around like countering spell effects, countering non-spell effects, things like that. So this is a non-spell effect because it doesn't have the spell type, but does something mid-combat interactively. So it's also cool you can get around like negate target spell. Okay, this isn't a spell, so good luck. Yeah, and so now Sacrifice Dude, you can play it as a spell. It works with Immolate. You can sacrifice it to trigger the effect. Works with the discard. You can discard it to trigger the effect. So there's just so much more. We've expanded the synergy horizon a lot. And then we now have discard stuff. We have other things. So we want to make things that interact with your bin. Talked about Necromorph, one of my favorite cards. Exhume, again, I talked about how I didn't want mana cheating. And this, I'm really happy with the design of this one because it's not mana cheating, but you can get some discounted mana. Put a unit with cost X or less from your bin into play, where X is your Dark Affinity. And so Dark Affinity is basically, it's a resource you put into play, and it's always going to be less than or equal to your total number of resources. So the upper limit on this would be like put a unit into play that you would be able to pay the cost for anyway. So like if you only have 4 resources in play, you couldn't reanimate a thing that costed 8 because you don't have 8 Dark Affinity. So this card is really cool because it lets you get that feeling like you're reanimating, and if your Dark Affinity gets pretty high, like up to 4 or 5, you can spend 2 mana to get back a 5 drop, but that's going to be when you have 5 Dark Affinity, like 8 to 9 mana, if you're in mono dark, so you're not jumping the gun in terms of what you would be able to play that turn normally. And then Wake the Dead, very similar. 8 mana, play up to 2 units from any bin with total cost 8 or less now for free. So Exhume is more like value, get back something you wanted, maybe get a little bit of mana ahead. Wake the Dead is more like, it's a battle spell, so mid-combat, you can bring stuff back, block, get stuff your opponent wasn't expecting, get a little bit of combat tricks, things like that. This is a counter spell I'm so happy about. So the cost to play it is erase X cards from your bin, and then you negate up to 1 target effect unless its controller erases X cards from their bin. So you might have been used to like cards where you trade mana with the opponent. This one you're trading cards in bin with the opponent. And so if you're discarding cards, filling your bin, you have more resources with which to like play into this card. Again, the art probably going to be replaced. It's very placeholder. But the effect I think is really cool. It's like a, for those who played Magic, like a Mana Leak or a Syncopate, but you're tackling it on a different axis, which is using your bin as a resource, which is really cool. And then we have other cards like Nuthier. When I'm trashed, this is kind of like another different type of counter spell for the dark element. You can discard it to negate non-spell effects. You can put it into play and attack with it, sacrifice it if you want to counter stuff. Really cool card. And so with all of these changes, we have now this really interesting, intricate synergy with like sacrifice, playing units, and things like that. We've taken what was originally a completely separate archetype, and we've meshed it a bit by switching to Afflicting Anima. It's really good in the archetypes that care about sacrificing things. Pretty good with the Earth element because you can discard augments and then augment them on things like Bumblecrab. Doesn't really matter if it's played as a unit or discarded and augmented. But it was missing a little bit more synergy with the other 2 elements. So we went even further. and added some decay theming to the game. Wood cares a lot about poison and -1/-1 counters, and light cares about losing health, or water cares about losing health, dealing damage and stuff. So we invented a Wraith token, which is pretty cool. Again, the art likely to change. But at the start of deployment, put a -1/-1 counter on an ally, and then when I die, augment a Wraith onto an ally. So you get this really strong unit, like a 3/3 unit, that shrinks your units over time, and it doesn't go away if it dies. So like if you make a Wraith, it's going to be a 3/3, next turn 2/2, next turn 1/1, next turn it dies. But if you have any other units in play, it's going to augment onto that unit, and the shrinking is going to continue. And if you keep making Wraiths, instead of getting 1 minus counter per turn, you're going to get 2, 3, and you're just going to slowly shrink your board. So it's cool because it's a really proactive, aggressive card, which the other elements like quite a bit. It's a token. It puts -1 counters on things, which there's a lot of synergies with counters. Yeah, this card helped a lot. And so there's quite a few different ways to create Wraiths. We talked about Afflicting Anima, pay 1 to make a Wraith. This just spawns 2 Wraith, and it's graftable, which is really nice. And then we have kind of the Wraith Lord, Cosmic Devourer, which just makes a Wraith every single turn on the turn. So it's like, you make 3 Wraiths, that's 9 power. They attack for 9. Let's say they kill one. Now you have to augment that Wraith onto this Wraith, and you have 3 Wraiths in play, so you're going to get 3 -1/-1 counters. You can distribute them however you want, but eventually you're going to end up with a situation where you're killing all of your own units if you don't use them fast enough. And then they all die, and you have to start over with no units left. And I just think that feels so good for an element that's all about discarding cards for value or sacrificing units for value, where you can create these tokens that are way overstated, but they die over time, and not only do they die over time, they put the rest of your stuff on a clock. So that was really fun. There's ways to mitigate this, so Rot Beast. There's a lot of cool things going on with this card. After combat, move all my other augments onto 1 or more enemies. So first off, it's a virus. So if the opponent has a unit with a lot of cool augments you want to steal, pop this on their guy, and they have to give you their augments. But if you find yourself in a situation like this, you can put all of those whites onto Rot Beast, and then he will spread the whites to your opponent. So there's a lot of cool ways to either you take the cost of whites and you're like, get a big army, or you can do it the other way where you are actually excited to get the whites onto your thing, because then you're using them to rot the opponent or whatever. So there's quite a few interesting designs around that. And then this is obviously a placeholder name in art. It's Dark Bub. It's a callback to Bub, one of the most beloved cards from the base set, 5/6 Unaware. So this guy is a 5/6 inverted, which inverts the stat changes of units. So this guy actually wants to have the whites on him because the -1/-1 counters actually make him bigger. So there's like, you're corrupting your own units. Suddenly you play this and you're excited about being able to take these minus counters and turn this into some giant monster to attack your opponents with. And so we also have themes around -1/-1 counters. Whites handle it the easiest because they just put them always. But like Pestilent Titan, when it attacks or blocks, puts a -1 counter on everything and gives each player a rot, which we'll talk about in a second. Glook is really cool. When I spawn or die, put 3 -1/-1 counters on target unit. The way Algomancy works, for most instances where you could play this, the first time you play it, you're going to have to put the counters on your own unit because you're not in the same region as an opponent. But then after that, when it dies, then you can put counters on an opposing unit. And there are ways to sneak this into play like mid-combat. Then you can get both benefits, because if it spawns mid-combat, then you can put the counters on an enemy, and then later let it die, get the counters. Really cool card. And then Entropic Entity, when a unit with counters on it despawns, draw a card. So this works if your own stuff dies, if an enemy dies. Just a really good, like, broad synergy payoff card. And Rot is something I said I would talk about. Sorry about this art. It might stay, but it's likely placeholder. At the start of deployment, you take damage equal to the number of Rot you have. And you use this with a dice to track how much Rot you have. And the goal of this is to put like a clock on the game, because the dark element is all about like quick bursts of benefit and then long-term consequences, kind of like making a deal with the devil or whatever. So rot solves that, but it also, for an element that's all about decay and rot, you can end up with people both like clearing their boards, right? Like Pestilent Titan just putting -1 counters on everything over time really can kill the board, both yours and your opponent's. So we added rot for a couple reasons. The first, to give a game inevitability, because if you're playing this, wiping the board, you at least are giving players rot, and that puts a timer on how long the game can last, because every turn you're taking 1 damage for each rot you have. If it attacks twice, suddenly you're taking 2 damage for each rot it has. And so you can't just stall out forever, eventually you have to deal with this rot and get aggressive on your opponent. Same with Plague Ritual. Each player discards a card, gains a rot, and augments a wraith on one of their units. This is like the ultimate decay card. You have less cards in hand, you're taking damage from rot. Putting a wraith on one of your units means they're shrinking every single turn. So it just gives you, like, leans into this feeling of the dark element is all about things decaying over time. But the other cool thing about rot is it makes a really good trade-off for really strong effects. So something like Thought Extraction, look at target player's hand and discard a card from it, you gain 1 rot. This is, well, personally I think this card's not very good, but all of our playtesters think it's quite strong. So the rot is a nice, like, cost to pay for such a strong effect, because now suddenly you're taking 1 damage every single turn, and this card is typically good early. So if you play it on turn 1 and the game goes 6 turns, you've done 6 damage to yourself for the cost of the game, which is fairly costly. Or Rotling, this card is so good. When I leave your bin, you can pay 1 to draw a card and gain a rot. This is probably one of the best card draw effects in the whole game, because you can, like, play it, graft it onto a unit, you draw a card when you graft it because it leaves the bin, and then when the graft triggers, but then you've gained 2 rot. There's other ways to, like, recall this from your bin to get rot that way, or if you erase it from your bin, you can also do that and draw cards. But, you know, the cost is you're going to end up with 3 or 4 rot by the end of the game, and that's fairly substantial. So those are, like, the core themes of the dark element. You have discard synergies, you have now trash synergies, like non-token things, where you're always just trading cards for advantage. Then you have decay, where you're, like, shrinking your own units to get ahead on stats short term. And then you have rot to, like, burn your opponents out and things like that. So it's a lot of fun. Just a couple other highlighted cards. This card's really fun. If I'm in your bin, you can play unit as if it had haste by erasing me as an additional cost to play that unit. So really good card to discard, but it's also a 3-1 for 1. You just want to play early, trade off, and then late game you can haste out a unit, and it's pretty cool. Reality Siphoner, at the end of turn, recycle your bin. Put a +1/+1 counter on me for each card recycled this way. So you can play it itself. If you're discarding cards, filling your bin a lot, this can be quite large for a 1-mana 2/2. But it's a virus, so if your opponent has, like, a writhing host in their bin you want to get rid of, you can put this on their unit, and now they have to erase their bin every single turn. So it's really, like, nice as a card you can play, a card you can virus on the opponent. Really happy with that design. And then this one is crazy. Spellbind. You can apply mods to a modular card from your hand and or bin as it's played. You still pay their costs. What this basically says is if you have graft effects in your bin, you can turn them into like a battle speed card with Spellbind. So, like, you pay 1 for this, and then if you have, let's say, like a Rotling, I mean, it's one of the best combos with it, you can pay 1 to mod the Rotling effect onto Spellbind. So now Spellbind says you gain 1 rot and does the Rotling thing of you can pay 1 to draw a card and gain 1 rot. So it's a really cool way to, like, mid-battle trigger a bunch of grafts from your bin. And then because this is modded, everything gets erased when it resolves. And then, again, a great way, you get the cost of having this cool enabler is you gain a rot is the effect of this card. But then you can do all the other fun stuff with it. So anyway, that's a pretty brief overview. I guess it was a long video, but there's so much happened with the dark element. And I'm really excited to be at the place where we are to say spring 2026 is when it's coming to Kickstarter. I'll have another video talking about the light element because the design of that was also really interesting. And if you want to see more elements, help us playtest. We're running games all the time in the Discord, link in the description. There's still I think at this point we've got the themes down, we've got the main mechanics down. Most of the cards are pretty good, but now we're just fine tuning, right? Does Pale Wing need 3 power? Does it need 4 power? You know, does it need 2 Dark Affinity? We're getting more into that fine tuning aspect of it, which is nice after 3 years of playtesting to be in that place. So if that sounds interesting at all to you, check out the Discord, come playtest with us, follow the Kickstarter because it's going to be awesome coming next spring. And thanks for watching. See you next time.